Good evening and welcome to The Core, coming to you live from Channels Television Studios in Abuja, Nigeria. My name is Kadria Ahmed. Just before we start the program, we bring you this piece of breaking news that June 12th has now been declared the new Democracy Day by President Muhammadu Buhari, and Chief Moshood Abiola, who was perceived to be the winner of the widely acclaimed June 12 elections, has been conferred posthumously with the highest honor of the land, the GCFR. Now to the topic of the day. Over the last few months, we've witnessed an astonishing series of events that increasingly point to an unraveling in the relationship between the executive and legislative arm of government in Nigeria. The two seem to be increasingly at loggerheads, and yesterday, things appeared to have come to a head as the National Assembly held a rare joint emergency session, after which they issued a communique which suggests they will try to impeach President Muhammadu Buhari unless he does a series of things, including essentially sacking the Inspector General of Police. The National Assembly meeting took place off the back of a summons issued to the Senate President Bukola Saraki by the police, who asked him to explain his relationship to suspected armed robbers who attacked banks in Ota, Kwara State, killing 30 people. The police claim during interrogation, the suspects pointed to the Senate President as their benefactor. The third arm of government, the judiciary, which appears to be taking a back seat on this particular row, has held its own share of differences with both the executive and the legislators. So, how did we get into this mess? And can Nigeria be governed effectively for the benefit of its people when the three arms of government seem to be at each other's throats? This and more on today's edition of The Core. But first, some background to the crisis.
The executive, legislature, and the judiciary.
Three arms of government in a democracy, all three with defined roles. As distinct as their roles are, the Constitution stipulates that they must work together in a finely tuned dance for the good of the country. But the relationship between the three arms of government in Nigeria cannot be described as harmonious. The executive and the legislature particularly have endured a relationship which many have described as strained and filled with rancor most of the time.
The truth of the matter is that we've got to come to terms with the fact that the attention of non-state actors, the attention of citizens, the self-imposed, self-righteous attitude of even the executive has held them down in such a way that most of those things that we used to do in the past to get the budget passed is not happening right now. So I don't want to call it fight. I want to call it politics. I want to talk about contestation.
The bone of contention is almost always in the way the National Assembly carries out its oversight role, as enshrined in Section 88 of the 1999 Constitution. The Assembly has accused the judiciary of interfering with its powers. It is particularly aggrieved by interim injunctions, stopping its oversight activities, the annulment of suspension of the legislators, and a host of other interventions. While the executive has expressed frustration at the slow pace of justice, some legal practitioners have accused the executive of interfering with the delivery of justice.
There are contradictory decisions of superior courts on the same subject matter in cases where facts are substantially the same without a clear attempt in subsequent cases to distinguish the earlier cases.
I don't want to blame the prosecution for all the problems. At times, the executive conduct may be obstructing the progress of a case before the court. I will not mention any case. The court should develop a template whereby if there is such interference, I'm not referring to any case, if there is such interference, you prohibit them
The judiciary has also come under scrutiny, having suffered its fair share of allegations of corruption and misappropriation of funds. One cannot forget the brush the judiciary had with the executive with the raid of homes of judges of the Federal and Supreme Court. When it comes to the relationship between the executive and the legislative arm of government, it can best be described as turbulent. Recent tensions have centered on the failure of the Inspector General of Police, Ibrahim Idris, to appear before the upper chamber despite multiple summons. The Senate has labeled Mr. Idris an enemy of democracy and declared him unfit to hold any public office within and outside Nigeria. The strained relationship also played out during the budgeting process. It took nearly 7 months for the National Assembly to pass the 2018 budget. The National Assembly put the blame for the late passage of the 2018 budget on government agencies for failing to defend their budgets when invited. But MDAs accused the National Assembly of frustrating the agencies during budget defense sessions.
If I were sitting in that house, what I would have done is to give a time frame. If you don't come within this time frame, all the MDAs that have already defended theirs, we could approve their budget and send it to the president for assent. Those that have not done their homework, they can come by way of supplementary appropriation, so that if there are 10 MDAs, for instance, and 6 or 7 have done it, the 3 that have not done their defense should not delay the whole nation.
Some government officials have accused the National Assembly of overstepping its boundaries. The chairman of the Presidential Advisory Committee Against Corruption, Professor Ite Sage, slammed the Senate for summoning him after he described lawmakers as childish and irresponsible. He said the Senate had no authorities to summon him, as he is outside the group of persons they can summon. Yesterday, in what appears to be a reaction to all of these, the National Assembly held an executive joint session and came up with some key resolutions.
There must be strict adherence to the rule of law and protection for all citizens by the President and all his appointees. 4, the President must be held accountable for the actions of his appointees and must be ready to sanction those that carry out any act which will ridicule or endanger our country and our democracy.
From all indications, the stage is set for a confrontation that is not likely to have any winners.
For our discussions, I'm very pleased to have with me in the studio Nigeria's Attorney General, Abubakar Malami. Thank you, sir, for coming on the show.
Thank you, Kadri.
Also joining us is Senator Aliyu Sabi Abdullahi. He's the spokesman for the Senate. Thank you, sir, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Deputy Inspector General of Police in charge of operations, Mr. Habila Joshiak, is also here. Thank you, sir, for coming. Me. And finally, Mr. Clement Nwako, who is a lawyer and a human rights advocate and who works with the Policy and Leadership Advocacy Center, PLAC. Thank you, sir, for coming. Now, let me start with you, Mr. Attorney General. Were you worried at all by the joint session that took place yesterday of the National Assembly and by the communique that came out of that joint session?
Well, within the context of being disturbed, I'm in no way worried at all. That is the truth of the matter. One thing I think I have to put across is the fact that democracy, and particularly the separation of power system of government, is about checks and balances, fundamentally targeted at displacement of abuses. So within the context of the appreciation of the fact that our democracy is such that it's tweaked in such circumstances that you must envisage the possibility of abuses, and you must envisage the possibility of desire for desired displacement, and then you must envisage the possibility of checks and balances.
So in your view, the National Assembly, what they did was well within the purview of their responsibility as a National Assembly?
Well, it's one thing for the National Assembly to have a joint session, but then it's the other for the purpose of assessment of what they have done within the context of the constitutionality and within the context of the legal framework as to whether it is sustainable. And if you are talking of blames, for example, relating to insecurity, relating to employment unemployment, associated other issues that were raised, as to whether indeed are issues that should naturally be placed at the doorsteps of the executive within the context of the blame game.
Okay, now there's an underlying issue in the communique that they issued, which was like that threat of a possible impeachment of the president. What do you make of that conclusion?
Now, issues were raised by the National Assembly during the joint session that they think constitute perhaps maybe misconduct. But then, within the context of the issues that were raised, you need now to assess. Let us take, for example, the issue of insecurity, which constitutes one of the issues that were raised, or perhaps maybe the issues that borders on unemployment, among others. On insecurity, for example, for the first 7 months, the executive has placed the budget before the National Assembly for consideration and the passage. And in the budget, for example, you have around 1 trillion naira that was intended to be meant for addressing the issues that borders on insecurity. And for the first 7 months, that budget has not been passed.
Okay.
If you are talking, for example, if you are talking as well on unemployment and associated social issues, for example, over 900 billion naira was embedded in the budget that was meant for social investment programs of the federal government. So within the context of the 7 months period, the senators, for example, were taking home over 70 million naira as their wages for the period of 7 months, while the social investment security net that was intended to be targeted, that was embedded in the budget,
we will get the Senate spokesman to respond to that. But I want to quickly ask you, what about the issue of the president taking responsibility for the actions of his appointees?
Where does the responsibility lies, for example, if you are talking of insecurity in a situation whereby the money meant, the appropriation meant for the budget relating to insecurity has not been passed by the National Assembly? Where does the blame lie?